I'm Sandra Newbury. I work for the University of California. I'm one of two faculty members there. It's Dr. Kate Hurley and I work together. And I also, I live in Wisconsin, which is a little bit confusing. And so I'm also adjunct faculty at the University of Wisconsin and teach the shelter medicine course there as well. One of our keen interests at the University of California is shelter housing. And so it's always really fun for us when we get to talk about housing and the effects that housing has on animal health and welfare, as well as some of the other effects that housing can have. And so we're going to talk about that now. Anything else? Do you have one? No, you're just... This is a really good list, and I think you might have gotten every single one. So we're going to talk about these now. And what I'm going to do is I decided to leave my own slides in kind of just in case everybody didn't get every single one of these. But I'm going to show you what lists kind of that I made. We can compare the list that I made, with the list that you made too. I talked about the 5 freedoms in my presentation that I gave this morning on the ASV Guidelines for Standards of Care. The 5 freedoms are what we based the guidelines of standard of care on. How many of you have ever seen the 5 freedoms before? Fantastic. It's fantastic to me, the number who have seen it and also the number who haven't, because the 5 freedoms has become just such an important part of my life and the way that I think about things, especially since we worked on the guidelines for standards of care. But I think that they are just such a great sort of written piece of something we can come back, a great reference point and look at and say, wow, are we meeting this? And for much of what I'm going to talk about when I'm talking about housing, I'm going to talk about kind of an outcome-based assessment of things. So when we say, well, is that housing good enough? What we're going to do is sort of look at the animal and say, well, how's it going? How's it working? And we'll look at a couple examples that way. And so I think it's something for us to really think about, that we have this incredible reference point. These were written in 1965 for livestock housed under intensive conditions, not for shelter animals. But I think what they did was really do a very good job of summing up the very most basic needs that animals have. And I think that we certainly want to be able to meet all of these needs in shelters. And so if we look at them just kind of quickly, freedom from hunger and thirst by ready access to fresh water and diet to maintain health and vigor, freedom from discomfort, freedom from pain, injury, or disease, freedom to express normal behavior by providing sufficient space, proper facilities, and company of the animal's own kind. And so really I'm laughing in like the best possible way inside with the list that you guys made, because like I could just go home, you're good. And so, it's just so important that we all can think of these things, because if we're not thinking of them, they're not going to happen for the animals in our care. Fear from freedom and distress by ensuring conditions and treatment which avoid mental suffering. And when I say, if we're not thinking about it, it's not going to happen, I think that we can look at a lot of old shelter buildings, and many of you might even be working in them, where you can just see whoever built those facilities. You can even sort of say, well, what were they thinking? And I joke about this all the time, but I really do believe that it's true that, whoever decided that cats should be stored in small metal boxes. I don't know who it was who decided that, but it certainly was not a cat who made that choice. And so I wanted to just sort of look through, with the 5 freedoms in mind, a few images that I tend to use when I'm really thinking about what animals need and what I want to give to them in shelters. And one of the things when I think about this, I think about, and it's the reason I've snuck in a picture of my son, is that, when I was in 5th grade, I remember learning about anthropomorphism and how it was sort of inappropriate to assign, our own, the way we might feel about something to the way an animal might feel about it. And I think that there may be cases where that's true, and certainly we need to understand animal needs and animal behavior to understand what things they need and what things they want. But I think it is really important for us to be able to extrapolate and understand how we might feel about something that falls within our own needs to how an animal might feel about not having something that falls within their needs. So this is one of my favorite cats in the world. His name is Foster because Dr. Hurley was unwilling to admit that she had failed this foster attempt, and so he remained forever her foster cat. And he's not stuck. This was a daily activity for him, and this was so important to what he wanted to do. And I took this picture, and I take it out periodically to look and really think what it feels like to be a cat. That's really what it feels like to be a cat, and what an amazing feeling that must be. And then think conversely what it must feel like to not be able to be a cat in this way. And here's my son, being a cat, because it is equally important to him. So even though he needs to play his violin, he needs to express that natural, normal behavior. This is my Labrador expressing her normal. She's actually yellow. And these are dogs, in a dog park. This happens all the time, right? So this is all just, I know that I don't need to convince you guys because I know you've seen this before. This is my cat who's a master of stress reduction and expression of normal behaviors and never lived, I think, in fear or distress of anything. But when we think about what animals do when we allow them to choose what they do, that cat really was that big. That, again, this is fun to look at these pictures, and what I'm talking about is that this is what animals need, and it's what they choose to do if we allow them to choose, and how important it is for them to be able to choose. And so how much we want to allow them to choose. This next picture is not quite so happy. But that the other thing that they need is transmission reduction. And so when we're talking about those environmental conditions that we talk about in the 5 freedoms, we want to make sure that we remember this is a huge part of it, that they also need protection. So they need all these other things, but that they also really need protection from getting sick, especially the babies. So here's some shelter animals, and I think these are, to me, sort of equally happy that, if we look at this kitty, that kitty's body wants to be on the other side of the fence than it is, but other than that, isn't that cat's body the way that cat's body wants to be? There's nothing constraining, or other than the fence, of course, the way that cat is lying. And if we look at that and start to understand what normal posture looks like, and then we understand, what does a cat look like when it's in a place that's really too small for it, we can see that there's great differences. This is a kitty from Best Friends. And this kitty just cracked me up. He sat up here all day long, and when people came by, he would turn so that he could watch them go by upside down. And I think of this picture as like this incredibly great illustration of enrichment, that whoever built this box didn't think that a kitty was going to sit there and wait and watch somebody go by upside down, but it provided enough space and opportunity for animals to express normal behaviors by providing structures that would allow for that freedom of expression. This dog is not anesthetized. He is comfortable. And he's on something, reasonably fluffy. And again, that's probably really, really important for that dog. So something to just consider. So what's the difference in this kitty's posture, right? It's enormous. And I know, again, I'm kind of preaching to the choir, but when we think about what this kind of housing does to this animal that wants to behave very differently, we can think about, from a medical perspective, our heart has a muscle, is a muscle. Our blood vessels have little tiny muscles, and that's what moves our blood around our body. Our lymphatic system moves when we move. So is this kitty's lymphatic system moving? It's not moving. Nothing really about him is moving. He has no real incentive. If we think about all of you, again, you mentioned this, you already know it, but I'm going to sort of explain it in a greater way. Is, you know, for a cat who are very fastidious animals, imagine how that feels to have your food right next to the bathroom and get little pieces of the bathroom in your food all day long. And really, you know, he's a pretty big cat, but this is not an exceptionally horribly small cage as many shelters go. It's a pretty normal cage, and he's a pretty normal sized cat. And so if we think about, you know, how stressful is that to that cat, and how do cats show their stress? And so we, you know, why don't we have dream housing in shelters? It's confusing. So I wanted to see, again, kind of check in with you guys and hear some of the reasoning, why you think. So here's another sort of example of what, you know, this is what we see in a lot of shelters. How many of you, just by curiosity, and I know I'm picking on it a little bit, but I know that it's not anybody's fault, right? Because this is something that was built usually a long time ago. How many of you have shelter housing for cats that looks a lot like this? Okay. So why do you think? What is it? Do you have an idea? Like, why don't we? So you guys already know about dream cat housing, right? Or dream animal housing, because we made a really good list. And maybe it was that we all know collectively, but I bet you all know pretty well individually too. Why? What do you think are the barriers? Yes? Funds, resources is a huge...
We're a small shelter, actually, for cats, and we also do cats that are being adopted out.
So great. So I can't remember the date exactly, but Kate Hurley and I are doing 2 webinars on upper respiratory disease in cats for Maddie's Fund. And Kate's going to talk about sort of the fundamentals of URI, and I'm going to talk about housing and stress reduction. URI in cats is probably 90% stress related, not infection related, because most cats come pre-packaged with herpes virus, and all we need to do is take them and stuff them into a little tiny cage and stress them out, and they're not getting transmission from somebody else. So if we're putting them into these little boxes because we think we can keep them safe in there, it doesn't do us any good. It's actually really shooting ourselves in the foot. So great, I'm so glad that you brought that up, because that's a really good point. Any other, yeah? Thank you very much. So what she said was they were originally used because of limited space and the volume of animals that needed to be housed. And so this is a balance that we see all the time. This balance between the capacity and the need to house a certain number of animals and providing individual animals with the space that we want, right? So we're always kind of balancing. And like in my dream housing, you know, every 2 or 3 cats would have their own house, right? I mean, I'd love to see that. That would be perfect. But because that wouldn't really be my dream shelter, because that shelter could only help 3 animals at a time. And even though they could probably get them in and get them out really fast in that scenario, I want to try to balance being able to help an appropriate number of animals with being able to balance giving them housing that meets their needs. And so this is what we kind of constantly go back to, is like, well, how big a housing unit should we give them? And well, then how many could we get in? And that's where we start to really look at population management. And since I talked about population management earlier, I'm not going to go into that in great depth here, but if you're interested, there's a lot of information on sheltermedicine.com about population planning and population management. And we've got a new chapter coming out in the new shelter medicine textbook that's at the publisher now. So that'll be coming out pretty soon. And it talks all about how you estimate and calculate how many is really productive and how many you really need, so that instead of having twice as many as what you actually need, you may be able to have half as many animals at any given time and give each animal twice as much space. And we've seen a lot of shelters. It sounds like you're kind of doing that. I'll circle back around and talk about that even more. Any questions about that? Great. So here was my list of what really matters. And I think you guys got all of them. I'm trying to think. Space quantity, space quality, separation, enrichment, hiding places, elevation, light cycles. Nobody said predator-prey relationships, I don't think. Did you? Okay. Flexibility of space. I don't think anybody said that, and we'll talk about that. Cleaning, isolation, temperature, air quality, fresh air, noise, activity, and safety. I don't think anybody said safety either, did you? Okay, so at least I still was up on you a couple. But that's okay. So those are the things, and that is a big list, isn't it? I mean, that's really a lot to think about when you're thinking about trying to provide appropriate housing for animals, especially when most of the time you're dealing with housing that you already have. So easy to talk about all this stuff when you're designing new housing, but it's a little trickier when what we're talking about is trying to remodel or something like that. This is the ASPCA of Dallas, ASPCA of Texas, sorry, in Dallas. And I just wanted you guys to see it because I think it's just stunning. And I worked on this design with them. And what's really cool about it is it's not perfect in every way in terms of function, but what is really amazing about it is the way that they made the function fit programmatically with what they're doing so that the function is all there for them. And I'll come back and talk more about some of the things we did here. But the other thing I wanted to say, and you guys, again, one of you pointed it out, is that how great for adoptions is this? You know, and they got tons of press for it. This is the cat room. These are actually, sorry, these are critters, but the cats are over here, and they call it the fishbowl. And the cats are all around the outside. So I'm not saying that, you know, I love every single thing about it, but it's really stunning. And I think from a perspective of, you know, how this affects adopters and how this affects the community's perception of this organization. I haven't gotten to go there yet. I've only gotten to see pictures, but it's pretty neat. Oh, and what I was going to say, which is, again, what you guys said, which is that maybe how attractive this is doesn't matter to the animals on a daily basis, but it matters to people, and people matter to the animals. And so in the end, it really does matter. So I talked a little bit with ASPCA of Texas that they've got programs involved in the way that they move animals. They have population planning and dog walking programs and all sorts of things that support the design and the housing within their shelters. So this is just a little clip from an article I wrote for Animal Sheltering magazine. And if you go and look, this was a series that Brenda Griffin and I did where we did a different article every issue of Animal Sheltering that related to the standards of care. And this was about a hand feeding program where they used it for all sorts of reasons, but one of the major effects that it had was noise reduction. So when you walk into this shelter, it's freaky. Like you walk into the adoption area and you expect all the dogs to start barking, and instead they all look at you and plop their butts on the ground. Because that's how they get fed. And it's an incredibly different feeling to walk in. And so the design of their adoption center isn't fantastic. And there's not really great noise reduction built into the design or anything, but it's really quiet when you go in. And it really, really makes you sort of wonder what's going on. And it's really easy to interact with the dogs because they're looking at you like the minute that you get there, and they're not splashing water on you and you know, lunging at you or whatever. Even if they're nice, they're really calm. And this is really truly like what it looks like when you go through. And it's a really great program from an enrichment standpoint. It's a great program just for all sorts of reasons. And we'll come back and talk about programmatic effects, but it's important to think about how programs can affect the animals, especially when we think about design. So cleaning, somebody said something about cleaning, and these are just a few examples of what we end up doing when we don't have housing that's well designed for cleaning, right? We end up, this housing was even a great example of housing that was well designed for cleaning. This actually could have opened this way, or it could have opened this way and been a double-sided run, but instead they had so many animals in this shelter that they had all the guillotine doors closed. So what are we going to do with this puppy when we want to clean his kennel? Take him out, and what do we do with him? Somebody's got to hold him, somebody's got to do something, somebody maybe. And so here, if they had programmatic support where the dogs could always get walked when they needed to clean the kennels, that might be okay, but that's a tough thing to guarantee, right? That there's going to be enough staff to walk all the dogs. There's one shelter I know of that's able to pull that off so far. I'm not saying that there's only one, but there's one that I know of. That when I consulted with them, they kept saying, we don't need that, because we always walk the dogs when we clean, and I hated it. And I was like, oh, it's not gonna work, but it totally works. And they have so many volunteers, and they all show up, and the dogs all go out when it's time to clean. And they all go out at once, which is really funny. They have this long path, and like all the dogs are out, getting walked all around, and they clean the kennels, and then they all come back in. But especially with a puppy, we don't want to have to take him out when we clean, because we'd really rather he stayed in so that he's not getting exposed to other things. This puppy actually lives in this shelter, and what they do is they just open all the doors, and all these dogs run around like crazy while they're getting cleaned, and that is definitely not what we want. Even if we were going to define them as a cohort or a play group or something like that, during cleaning is not the time when we would want them to all be out splashing around in disinfectant and everything else. And so it's really important as we look at the housing to think about what effect the housing is going to have on the cleaning, and make sure that there is some kind of plan. And so either when you're designing your housing, you have to think about how you're going to clean it, or with the housing you already have, you have to think through what kind of plan you're going to have for cleaning. And so we'll talk a little bit about that. And here's some kittens where it would have been a nice idea if these feral cat boxes were in their cages. We could clean while they were in the feral cat boxes, but instead what they did is they actually stacked up all these feral cat boxes and took all the cats out of their cages, put them in boxes, and then cleaned the cages. So all the animals had to come out and wait, and that's an awful lot of kittens to be stuffed in a box while you're trying to clean. So when we plan for cleaning, the easiest thing for dogs and the most ideal thing really from our perspective is double-sided runs. So that we can close the door on the double-sided run, clean one side, move the dog, and then clean the other side. This works especially well when the kennels are lined up, because we can move all the dogs in one line, clean the whole side, and then move them all over and clean the whole side. And usually the difference in the amount of time that it takes to do that versus taking dogs out and all that other stuff is really just enormous. We also love double-sided cages for cats, and that's what these are. There's little portholes here, and this also addresses what at least one of you brought up about the issue of having a separate bathroom from your bedroom, where we can put the litter box over here on this side, and then this can be the bedroom and the kitchen. So it's like a kitchenette. In the meantime, if you can't do this, spot cleaning for cats works really well. Now this is a nice big cage that this kitty lives in, and you can see he's taking advantage of his opportunity for elevation there, right? And he has something fluffy to sit on. And if I wanted to clean this cage, I would take the kitty, put him in his box, and then I would spot clean. Why wouldn't I just let him be out and socialize with me while I'm cleaning? He might. If I'm going to spot clean his cage, we'll talk about that a little bit, but I wouldn't even probably use disinfectant if I was spot cleaning his cage. Yeah. Right. So that's especially true with friendly cats. So when you're spot cleaning, in a way, the cats that you most need to tuck away while you're spot cleaning are the really friendly ones, because you're trying to clean and they're right? And so they're going to rub all over you, and then the next one's going to rub all over you, and then the next one's going to rub all over you. And so in many ways, it really, people always think, oh, it's feral cats or unsocialized cats that are ones you want to put away while you're cleaning, but in many ways, for their own protection and everybody else's protection, you really want to put them away. We'll come back to that kitty in his cage in just a little bit. And this is an example. This is actually from the Toronto Humane Society, where they had fairly large size runs, but they didn't have double-sided runs. And what they did is they actually cut holes in their cinder block walls, and then they retrofitted this with a guillotine door. And there's guillotine doors out there that companies are making that you can use for retrofitting kennels. And so they turned their single-sided runs into double-sided runs. And that is a similar thing, and I'll show you some pictures in just a few minutes, that we do with stainless steel cages for cats. And we joke about it all the time because we even will sometimes go and just do it ourselves. Danae Wagner, who's a member of our program, figured out how to use a plasma cutter, which is what you need to cut stainless steel. And we joke all the time as veterinarians, it might be the most important surgery we can do, cutting holes in stainless steel cages. So I'll show you that in a minute. Drains, again, like we can talk all about what different kinds of drains are out there. Either individual drains or trench drains, any of these can be acceptable if they're properly functioning, if they're well designed, appropriately placed, and easily cleaned. So why is this inappropriate drain placement? It's probably cheap, right? Because you can drain both kennels. Yes?
It just shares germs. I mean, if a dog urinates, if you're hosing it, the water that you're hosing squirts all over the other kennels.
Yeah. What else? So everybody who has to come down this corridor, right, has to walk in. So the kennels are sloped towards the drain, so you can see everything runs out. Lovely. So we don't want to do that. Flooring, again, you want to balance cleanability, durability, and cost. These are what everybody has to balance when they're choosing flooring. It would be great if we could just have whatever flooring we wanted every time we were building, but we usually have to sort of balance that. Sealed concrete is actually the most commonly used, but it's very important to remember that it needs to be sealed concrete. Concrete is incredibly porous stuff, and if it's not sealed, it will absorb everything, including all the pathogens. Problems with concrete is that you can end up with a lot of cracking, or as I said, it could be porous. And you can paint concrete, but it needs to be sealed first. Otherwise, it'll just blister off because it'll absorb water from the ground too. And then again, there's multi-layer epoxy resin, and that's something that's probably more our favorite. Those are the two probably most common. So we talked about how kind of programmatic things affect housing needs and requirements and can really make what could be problem housing work out much better. The same is true where housing affects other space needs that you have. And sorry, one of my pictures dropped out here. But they were all sort of illustrating the same thing, which is that when we have this kind of housing, which we like to call walk-in housing, and this is San Francisco ASPCA. I'm not sure why this picture sort of scooted over like this, so you can't see the whole thing. But this is San Francisco ASPCA. This is their individual animal housing. So each animal gets a little room. And in this shelter, I don't know if you can see or not, this is indoor-outdoor, and the other picture that I had was the outside, but hopefully it'll show up later because I think I used it twice. So this is actually indoor-outdoor housing. But the difference is in this case that they have a place to meet and greet people. So how nice is it for the adopter to meet the animal in its environment? So, you know, we all know when we take a cat out and we take it to a new room, then the cat's like, whoa. And dogs too. And so if you can actually just go into the room and meet with the animal, it also actually dramatically reduces the need for other spaces in the shelter for that purpose. So instead of having a meet and greet room, each cat has its own room for meeting and greeting, which is very, very nice. So they cut back on space needs for other rooms, and volunteers or other people doing enrichment can actually work with the animals in their own space, which ends up being a really nice thing. I think for cats and dogs, I think people tend to think about this more for cats, but I think it's really important for dogs as well, and I think there's other programmatic things. It's often that dogs tend to live in housing that's easier to be walk-in housing, and it's funny because it's sort of ironic that we do that, And then it tends to be that every time we want to interact with the dog, we get them and we take them out instead of actually going in. And so there's some shelters that are doing reading programs and other kind of programs where you go in and spend time with the animal actually in their enclosure. And those are really nice programs because we tend to, in shelters, sort of teach dogs that when a human shows up, it's the 4th of July. But what a lot of people are actually looking for in a dog is a dog that will just hang out with them and be quiet and calm. And so if we teach them that sometimes what we want is to come in and hang out and be calm, that's really important. This is my cat, Lucci, and I think he's the longest cat I've ever seen. And this is something that we've been doing. We started it a little bit as a joke, but we've really been doing it to sort of say, well, how much space does a cat need to express its normal behavior? Lucci is, you have to appreciate the triangulated distance here to see that he's actually about 36 inches long when he stretches out. And so if we put him in a housing unit where there isn't a 36-inch stretch for him to stretch out, he's not going to be able to. And he's actually, I adopted him from a shelter that had him in a little tiny cage, and my son and I went in and we saw him sitting there kind of like, oh, this is kind of weird. And this is a very, very normal behavior for him. This is a most of the day behavior for him. And so, you know, we really try to think about that. And, you know, conversely, I've lost, there it is. Okay, I lost my mouse. If we look at this kitty, I'm sorry, a bunch of my pictures have sort of eked over to the right-hand side there. I'm not quite sure why. And look at this kitty in here. And what do you notice about this guy and his housing? So I heard somebody say he can't hold his tail up. Yeah, and so if you look at the guidelines for standards of care, we actually made a note of that, how important it is, because how important is it to a cat to be able to lift their tail up? Why is it important? It's a huge way for them to express themselves. It has to do with balance. Is there anything else that you notice about what's happening to him in this housing unit? He's pacing because they're getting ready to feed, just so you know. So he's excited about that. And he's excited about the food. And so what's he doing with his back? Look at his back. We might have missed it already. So cats arch their back when they're happy, right? And when he's doing it, it's not every time, but when he does it, his back hits the top of the cage. And so he's trying to show a positive behavior, and he's getting kind of negative reinforcement for it. Yeah.
So I'm just curious because we've heard a lot about the small cage and clean around a cat in that situation.
Yeah, so those cages, I mean, so these cages, this cage, if we think about the 5 freedoms, and like I'm not trying to pick on you or your shelter at all, I'm just trying to say like, right. But so a cage this size, like, is this an appropriate housing unit? It's not. I mean, we have to just say, like, it's just not. And so I'm not surprised you can't clean around. Like, you can't. You absolutely can't. So the choice to try to clean around a cat in this housing unit would be more stressful, I think, than taking them out. And so what we end up with, and this is something important to recognize and important for me, I think, to say that I know this and I know it's true. I'm not living in like some pie in the sky. I want us to dream about what we want for housing, but many of us have what we have. And what I want is for you to go from where you are to better. You know, and so I hope that there'll be something in here that'll help you go from where you are to better. And then I hope, you know, next month maybe or next year, you know, and I hope you'll all start to sort of figure out, are there ways that you as an organization can start strategically planning to get better and better and better. But I think what you're saying is taking an animal out to stretch and exercise is really important. And that's one way that you're trying to mitigate the problem of having housing that isn't big enough for an animal to move normally and stretch to their full body length. It has to be balanced, right? And sometimes the question is, well, when should you do that? You know, so should you let them out and let them all run around while you're cleaning? maybe not.
Like individual usually,
Right.
but I hear more about you saying them coming out of their cages like their home is more stressful.
Right, their cage is their home, but if their cage is so is inappropriately small, then they have to get out and they have to have activity. What we've seen, and I wish I had brought a picture of it, but I don't, what we've seen is some shelters who have actually built in like little exercise rooms into their rooms where they have caging that they feel is really kind of too small. And then you can take the animals out and you can clean and disinfect between the animals. It's especially important with kittens. But some shelters, even in Chemung County, is anybody here from Chemung? They did great. I mean, they did a really nice job, and I've got some pictures I can pull up later to show you where they put in like chain link little play areas in some of their rooms. And we did a little case study on the remodeling that they did. I mean, you should talk about it because, you know, you guys didn't spend a ton of money. But it's very practical. It's not like ASPCA of Texas, but it really made a huge difference for the animals that were involved. And so there's lots of sort of practical ways of thinking about things. Does that answer your question?
Yeah.
Okay. Now I see what happened. Okay. Here's the right side. So if we think about, you know, what do we want, and this is from the Guidelines for Standards of Care, what we want when we're thinking about like how should an animal fit into their space, and again, from an outcomes-based assessment. So I'm not going to say the cat needs at least 36 inches. My cat needs at least 36 inches. Others may not. But we want them to be able to turn freely, stand easily, sit, stretch and extend their limbs, move their head, sit, stand without their ears touching the top of their enclosure, hold their tails erect, and then again, posture comfortably for eating, drinking, urination, and defecation. Have you ever seen animals try to go into a litter box and they just can't posture the way they need to be able to go to the bathroom? And so this is what we need to think about when we look at the enclosure. And this is hard, just so you know. I mean, this isn't easy. Like I feel bad because I think sometimes, you know, it's a really hard thing as an organization to be able to look at your housing and say like, it really isn't appropriate housing. But the only way you're ever going to make it better is to be able to look at it and say, and then try to move on from there. And so that's something to think about. Any questions about that? Okay. So space quality is the next thing. So that was kind of space quantity. When we think about space quality, again, this a little bit has to do with quantity, but there was a study that Waltham did where they looked at eating habits of cats, and they were looking at cats that were having issues with inappetence, and we see that in shelters. And what they found was that if you had this 2-foot triangulated distance between the elimination area, the food area, and the resting area, that cats ate better. And so if we think back to that kitty that I showed you in kind of the big cage sitting up on top of the carrier, that's a better setup than, of course, than the kitty that's in the too small cage. But that, you know, again, that's not so surprising that animals eat better when their food isn't right next to the bathroom. But the truth is that it probably has a better effect when the food isn't right next to where they sleep either. How many of you, with your own cats at home, how many of them sleep near their food bowl? Mine don't. I rarely find them there. I think my Labrador probably would if I would let her. But, you know, normally we, I don't know if you're like this too, but, you know, if I have food in front of me all day, like we ate our lunch and then they take that away. They don't just leave it for us all day. And so having food constantly in your face may not actually lead to eating better. This is another, what's going on here? This is a picture, again, of a dog in a double-sided run, and I just wanted to show this kind of layout issue where this is the bed, the resting area, here's the feeding area, and then this extra area, and you can see that he's got a poop back there, so he's pooping away from his box. Here's another example of primary enclosure layout, and this is a renovation that I was talking about. This is where we cut the holes in the cage, and this kitty's showing off his newly cut cage hole. And this comes from really good population management. I was talking about population management earlier, that often when you really change the way you're managing your population, you can end up having fewer animals, and when you have fewer animals, you can offer each animal better housing. So this is what the actual porthole looks like when we do it. And so then the animals can have, this kitty has a bathroom over here, and then this is the bedroom over on that side. And it worked really well. This is actually ones that we did ourselves in Wisconsin. I just wanted to show you, this is a study that we did where what we looked at, because we're such huge advocates for this double-sided thing and the separation, and we wanted to look at, we have almost 3 times, I think, as many dogs in this study now, and nothing has changed. I just need to update my graph. It was sort of shocking to us, because this is what we thought, but we didn't think it would be this clear, where almost every dog, if they have 2 sides, they choose to urinate and defecate on the other side. And the ones where we were like, wow, these guys urinated and defecated on both sides, it was almost always puppies. But that adult dogs, and even, you can see how few it is, even for the puppies. It's not surprising, right? I mean, we would make the same choice, right? It's a normal thing, but it was really interesting to see it, and this data alone has been able to help us convince a lot of shelters to go with double-sided housing rather than single-sided housing, because you can see if that's the choice, again, it's kind of like foster cat climbing the tree. If this is the choice that they would naturally make, and then we prohibit them from making that choice, how does that feel to them? And that's probably a contributor to other problems that those animals are having, but at least we can have the understanding that stress is involved there. So here's just a little discussion about space flexibility, and this is one where you guys didn't mention this. How many of you have this kind of setup in your shelter where you kind of have a holding area and an adoption area? Okay. So this is a pretty common setup where there's like holding and adoption, and this really oversimplifies the situation, but I wanted to have you start thinking about flexibility in a different sort of way. So if we say that, what if we get rid of the holding area, and instead of thinking of it just as holding, we start to think of it as smaller, broken down units. So in fact, what we might have, and probably some of you do, we could say, well, okay, we've got URI ISO, GI ISO, so instead of building one big area, we built 6 smaller areas instead. And today we're going to set it up like this. So we'd have a URI ISO, a GI ISO, rabies quarantine, an ISO for infectious skin like ringworm. Maybe we have a room of juveniles awaiting going to foster, and maybe we'd have a non-infectious treatment area. We might have other things. But what's nice when you have smaller areas that can be used flexibly is that, let's say we decide, well, you know what, we don't actually have any bite cases right now. We don't have any infectious skin disease either. Let's change the infectious skin disease, and we're going to transport animals in, and we're going to put our transport into that area. And so instead of that room having a label on it saying infectious skin ISO, it's just Flex B or Flex F. And you can use Flex F for whatever you want when the needs change. So today we're going to take in a transport, and we're going to use that for transport intake, and maybe we're going to do that again if we don't have any URI, and we're going to use the URI for that. And what's really nice about having these small spaces is you can use them however you need to in flexible ways. That's the whole idea. We can do the same thing with adoption areas, right? So we could have all of these adoption areas instead of one bigger adoption area. And what we might do is this week, we're going to move all the animals that came in from Transport 1 as a cohort and move them into Transport 1 adoption. And then we would open this area up and use it for something else. And we'd use, move Transport 2 into this area. And that's one of the things that actually the shelter in Dallas actually designed that into their system, because they do a lot of transporting in. So they're able to move animals in cohorts through the shelter. Boulder Valley does the same thing, where they bring in a transport and they move them as a cohort through their organization. And so just wanted to sort of introduce this idea to you. And whenever you have the chance, if you're sort of putting housing together or sort of thinking about housing areas, much, much better to have flexible space, which usually means more smaller areas, but not zillions of animals jammed into smaller areas, the appropriate number of animals, an appropriate number of animals in each section. Any questions about that? I'm going to move on to group housing. Yes?
Kind of goes along with what you're saying. Where I work, there's lots of community rooms, maybe 2 smaller rooms, and they're happier again.
Yay, and that's like a perfect segue to group housing. Yeah, so it's a perfect segue into what I'm talking about with group housing. So you want to think about that idea of those smaller, flexible spaces, especially when you start to move to group housing. So group housing is great for lots of things. And again, this is from the 5 freedoms that we want animals to be able to have company of their own kind. Joke all the time that, you know, this is the great side of this, right? These guys love each other. They're actually brother and sister. And these two aren't, but they came in as a bonded pair. And this is actually in the Las Vegas shelter after they had really just a horrid outbreak. And they had been randomly commingling animals. And I went through the shelter when I came back. And each animal had its own kennel. And I got to this cage. And I was with somebody who was giving us a tour, and she immediately sort of jumped in to say, we didn't just put them together randomly, like they love each other. And it was totally true. Like these 2 dogs were so in love with each other, and it was so sweet to see, and they had such benefit from being together. So this is a great example. So you guys watch this. And somebody call out what you're seeing. I always want to, like, I wish I had a laser pointer that went like from eyes to like, and look at this guy, he's just like, ding. And this guy really wants to eat, and he doesn't really care that he's probably going to get whapped. And she's like, I'm so nervous, but I want to just cut across. So there's too many animals in the space, and can we tell that because we're counting how many animals and the size of the space? It's from an outcomes-based perspective. We can see the way the animals are behaving. This guy especially, like he really wants to eat. So there's too many animals in the space and not enough what? Not enough bowls, which there's an R word we use when we were talking about why we don't have perfect housing, resources. So not enough resources, too many animals, not enough resources relative to the number of animals that are present, right? What other kinds of resources? You guys said there's not enough food bowls. And it's really interesting, like these food bowls are here all day long. So people might think, well, there's plenty of time for everybody to get to them, right? But clearly from an outcomes-based assessment, there is not. What else is there not enough of? Litter boxes. I don't know if there are more over here, but certainly in this image, there's only one. So there's certainly not probably enough litter box stations, right? Because even if they have like a whole wall of litter boxes over here, there's not enough over here. Not enough spaces. And what do you notice about the spaces that are available? There's nothing in there for them. And what else? Yeah, there's one soft one back here.
They're not really enclosed or very up, very high. In ours, we have like milk crates that go almost all the way up to the ceiling.
Yeah, so not much opportunity for concealment, which animals really like. Not much opportunity for elevation, and lots of stress in this room, right? So your comment was a great, so what could we do? We could really subdivide the space and subdivide the cats. What do you think happens also when a new cat is added? For hierarchy, so hierarchical readjustment, right? Every time a new animal comes in, and that new animal would have to find a new territory. You can sort of see, like this kitty's like, this is my territory. Here, And this kitty's got his like little safe place here. And so it's really great. I mean, it's really lovely to hear the way that you guys are able to sort of look and have this outcomes-based assessment of what you're doing. And I really encourage you to look at what's happening in your own shelters and look several different times a day. There's one shelter that I worked with, and I had been there a million times, but I had never been there during cleaning. That has mostly community open spaces. And for whatever reason, cleaning to these cats was so stressful that every time I went to see cleaning, the cats were just fighting like cats. Every time, you know, because there were so many stressful interactions going on during that time that alone was really just enough, like a daily dose of stress for those animals. So we really want to think about that. The other thing we want to think about when we're thinking about community space and thinking about making community space bigger rather than smaller is something I call exposure risk. So this is this like goofy animation that I made to try to explain this concept. So what if you have one animal in a room? The exposure risk is 1, right? Can we agree on that? Seems simple. If we add a second animal, now the exposure risk for both of them changes to 2. Does that make sense? We can go along like this. We have 3, the exposure risk is 3. When we add a 4th, the exposure risk goes to 4, right? If we take 1 out, what happens? It stays at 4, right? Because everybody got to an exposure risk of 4. Take another out. Now we have 2 cats in this room, but we still have an exposure risk of 4. Now we have just 1 animal, but we have an exposure risk of 4, right? What happens if we add a new animal? Goes up to 5 for both. So now we only have 2 animals, but we have an exposure risk of 5. So you can imagine in a large room with a lot of turnover, you can see exposure risks really start to skyrocket. This can happen, it can happen in foster homes, it can happen in community rooms, it can even happen just in shelter rooms where there's not a lot of infectious disease control. This is where we see real problems with things like canine distemper virus have a great way of being perpetuated in environments like this. Feline FIP is something that we see often in situations where exposure risks get very high. So what can we do about it? What if we end up in a room where the exposure risk is 5 and we have a second room where the exposure risk is maybe unknown, but let's say it's 5. What would the right thing to do when a new cat comes in? Great. Great. Why is she saying that? Does anybody know? She said we would combine them both. So we'd have 2 cats then with an exposure risk of 10. Do you like that idea? That's how I'm putting it. So it doesn't sound great, but it's not so bad. An exposure risk of 10, it's okay. It's not what I would want for a cat who is staying short term in a shelter. So for a cat or a dog that's staying short term in a shelter, which is like less than 2 weeks, probably the best thing for that animal is to get in and get out and go home and then find playmates. For animals who are staying longer, they need interaction with other people, and there's all sorts of kind of analogies I could draw here to whether or not it's worth having an interaction for the infectious disease risk that might be associated with that. And for a longer term thing, it might be worth that risk, but for a shorter term thing, it's probably not worth the risk. And so yes, I would say we would combine the 2 of them because then we get the other room back to 0. So even though we got to an exposure risk of 10, we never got to an exposure risk of 200. We never got to exposure risks of 2,000. And so it's always better. This is called all in, all out housing in a way. Sorry. It's okay. No, I got it. So it's called all in out housing, where what we do is we're always getting the room back to zero. And that's the idea. So you're never perpetuating whatever might have been the exposure that was going on in that room. You're always starting back at zero. And so that's a great way of managing community rooms. It's a great way of managing play groups, actually, too. A lot of the concepts are the same for play groups and for community rooms. So again, it's really another question of balancing, where we really want to balance the risks. As the stay gets longer, enrichment becomes more important. When the stay is shorter, exposure risk becomes more important. Both of them are always important. It's just really a question of which one is more important. This is funny because Dr. Janesco actually took this movie, and here she is. So this is a little bit upsetting, this little video, but I wanted to show it because I think people think about community housing and they really think about, I can get people to understand exposure risk, and it sounds like actually you guys already have a pretty good understanding of what I'm going to talk about with this, but that there is behavioral exposure risk as well. And so first I'll show you the video and then I'll tell you what's going on. So what's going on? He can't get any food. He's like, help me. We fixed this, just so you know. This video was actually very instrumental in fixing this. So, he can't get anything to eat. Nobody noticed this except Dr. Janesco, who happened to be standing there taking videos, because this shelter was so busy getting all these food bowls down and getting to all the work that they had to do, that after the food bowls went down, they weren't standing and watching. But this video, once they saw it, they were like, oh my goodness. So things changed quite a bit. What I want to talk about a lot is, well, let's first talk about what's going on for him. So he's randomly commingled with this other dog. Is that to his benefit? No. What's happening for him? He's not getting anything to eat. He's getting pretty stressed. He may, because he's probably getting pretty hungry. And right now they're not actually fighting because he's being really respectful. But he's gonna get hungrier, right? So what about this girl? Is she a bad dog? No. We don't know. So after Stephanie took this video, we went and we pulled up this dog's record. This dog had been randomly commingled with about 10 to 15 other dogs who had come in and gotten adopted, come in, gotten adopted, come in, gotten adopted. There was a history of her as being friendly, sweet, loving dog when she came in to the shelter. But we can make it, I might start guarding my food too if that was happening over and over and over and over to me. And so we need to understand what happens with exposure risk, that putting animals together, it's so important for them from a socialization standpoint, but we always have to watch and be careful and understand what we're doing and understand that it is always about balancing what's happening behaviorally, and that it should always be beneficial and never ever random, and never ever because we just don't have enough space. Yes?
A lot of times what I see where I work is a coworker, we're trying to move a cat that's ready to go into a visual cat where that cat will fit in.
Right, and that's why, so there's lots of circumstances in which I absolutely love community housing. And I think community housing does a world of good for animals. It often creates situations where we can provide higher quality, less stress-free, like you were talking about, housing for animals. There have to be alternatives, and there have to be alternatives for animals where it's just not working. And we always have to be very, very careful about monitoring animals that have been put into group settings, where we wouldn't want to just put animals in and just hope they do well. And for an animal like this, it's not appropriate to put her in group housing anymore from an outcomes-based perspective. Okay. So I thought we had lots of time, but we're running out of time, but I'm going to go a little bit quicker here. So we talked a lot about separation. You guys knew about separation right from the beginning. When we think about it, we really want to think about what kind of separation do we need? Do we really need isolation? Do we really need quarantine? Or is actually physical separation enough? What do you think when we separate cats for URI, when we tell you, and we do all the time, that you should remove sick animals from the general population? What kind of separation do they need? What do you think is the major effect of removing those cats from the general population? What kind of transmission do you get in the way of?
Like indirect through the air, is that what you mean?
Yeah, like is it through the air? Is it fomite transmission? We stop them contacting each other directly.
Well, if the fish nose to nose, you don't
Right.
Is that what you mean? You don't want.
Right. Sorry, maybe the question's not a good enough question. So when we remove cats, especially for URI, what we're doing is we're preventing fomite transmission. It's not aerosol transmission. Cats are not actually really able to aerosolize their viruses they just don't really do it. But what happens is when we put them in a separate room and we kind of change the rules, and everybody who goes into that room understands that those cats are sick, it helps to prevent disease spread through the general population. So a lot of it is actually human psychological change rather than the actual need for isolation. Does that make sense? Whereas for dogs can aerosolize their viruses, so real isolation is probably more important for them, but still the major effect of removing sick dogs from the general population is to prevent fomite transmission, because it's a human psychological effect when you move them and separate them. So even if you don't have an isolation area, separating the sick dogs from the general population has an enormously beneficial effect, because you can handle those animals last, care for those animals last, change the way that you're treating them. You can change clothes after you handled them and interacted with them. You can tell volunteers to interact with them last. So those are things that are really important when you think about it. Don't always think, oh, I don't have isolation, so I'm just going to leave all the sick animals in the general population. It's one of the most important sort of associations we see in shelters with disease is the shelters that leave animals where they are instead of removing them to another place, sick animals, we see more sickness. Okay. Temperature is really important. I'm not going to go into it too much, just to say, these were puppies that were taken as a seizure case, and then they were brought into a shelter in Texas, and it was so cold in the shelter. I was wearing like 3 fleeces, and these guys didn't have anywhere warm to sit, and they have no body fat. And so we just really need to think about, sometimes where human comfort level is not where animal comfort level is. And I wanted to just read you quickly a quote from the guidelines. That it is essential that each primary enclosure allows an animal to comfortably maintain normal body temperature and humidity levels should be evaluated at the level of the animal's body within its enclosure. And then, oops, let me go back. And here what we've got is, because of breed and body condition, medical condition, hair coat, facial conformation, and age differences, animals must be monitored individually to ensure their comfort and to ensure they can adequately maintain their body temperature. And so, again, it's an outcomes-based assessment that we need to look at the animals and really see how they're doing and if they're warm enough or if they're cool enough. That we do make general recommendations that are based on sort of what the AVMA is recommending for normal comfort zones, but a normal comfort zone may not be the appropriate comfort zone for every animal. We talked about air quality, and so I'm not going to talk too long about that because we're running out of time. But I did want to just show you this picture. This is actually from a dairy barn, and these are calf housing units. And this is a research study that was done at the University of Wisconsin, and I've actually been working with these guys on some ventilation concepts for dog kennels as well. And what they found was that even in barns where we could measure the ventilation of the general air in the barn and find that the barn was very well ventilated, what they call the pen microenvironment, or the place where the calf was actually living. The ventilation wasn't actually getting into that area. And so calf respiratory disease was increased fairly dramatically. And we suspect that similar things are true in animal shelters, and that it may be that when we think about how much ventilation we need in a room, and we talk about 10 or 15 air changes per hour, even that may not actually appropriately ventilate the area where the animal actually is. And so what's more important is to start thinking about ways of delivering the ventilation to the animals. And in this study, one of the most important things for them was figuring out how to ventilate these calf pens without chilling the animal. And so I wanted to say that there's so many parallels here with this study and the things that we do in animal sheltering, that I'm really excited because Dr. Nordland is really interested in looking at how we do this. And anyway, so what UW did is they came up with this system using these giant cloth ducts. I don't know if you guys have seen these. They're sort of like plasticized cloth. And they've engineered the holes so that they can get them so that when they ventilate, the air goes straight into the kennel, but they can really like precisely control the speed that the air comes in so that it doesn't chill the animal, and the ventilation rates drop dramatically. The other thing that drops dramatically if you're designing a new facility is the cost. So these things blow fresh air in, and they ventilate at a rate that is, if you were going to do it through like the normal HVAC systems, would cost probably like 50 times what these systems cost. And so it's a really very interesting work that they're doing, and incredibly relevant to animal shelters. This is just to let you know, when we think about this ventilation for sick animals, we know that cats are able to send droplets out 5 to 6 feet. Dogs are able to aerosolize their pathogens about 20 feet. So that's really the difference, but cats cannot aerosolize their viruses. Here's a picture that I want to show you. This is the outside component of these little walk-in housing units. They're indoor-outdoor housing units. And people don't think enough, I think, about indoor-outdoor housing for cats. So we'll end up in just a minute here. This is a foster kitten of mine who was broken in so many places, I couldn't believe it. And this is just to sort of stress the importance of enrichment. This kitten, I've never seen a kitten as broken as this kitten was, and mostly what he was able to do, was lay on his back, and he couldn't really do anything, and he would just lay there, like, oh. And my son decided that he really needed something to play with, because he was, after all, a kitten, and he was right. And I think, when we think about enrichment and like how much animals need enrichment, this was just amazing to me that my son hung this up. And I mean, this went on for hours. And so, there are so many ways of providing enrichment, and it's just, I think, so important that we can't think about it enough. And with that, he did, and he actually just got adopted. Took him a long time to recover. Anyway, so thank you very much, and visit our new blog that we just started, Foster Fun with Dr. Newbury. And I want to give special thanks to the ASPCA for their partnership that makes my position possible.